working on right now, trying to learn a little more about Fischers. So let's see, now I'm going to stop the share quickly because something's going on with my PowerPoint. Technology is great when it works. All right. So Fischers, first of all, I should say this is a picture of a Fischer. That big tree you see in the background is this female Fischer's reproductive den. I'll talk more about what reproductive dens are in a little bit. So what are Fischers? They are not kingfishers. They're not a bird, they're a mammal. So they are a member of the weasel family. And the weasel family is one of the biggest and most diverse families of carnivores across the world. In Minnesota, we have a number of different weasels, some of them shown here: otters, stoats or short-tailed weasels, minks, badgers. And so Fischers are one of our weasel family members in Minnesota. And if you kind of zoom in on Fischers, they're in this smaller group within the weasel family that we call the Martes species complex, or the Galaninae, which is just fancy Latin. What it is a group of 11 species that currently exist. The top one here is the Tyra. The Tyra lives in Central and South America. And to me, it looks very much like a Fischer that doesn't need as much fur. This group also includes the wolverine, the Fischer, obviously, and then 8 different species of marten that are distributed kind of across the Northern Hemisphere. And so my interest in Fischers is partly, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the fact that they function as both predators and prey here in the ecosystems that they live. But I've also done a bit of research with some of the other members in this group. And so a lot of things that we're interested in too is just learning how Fischers compare to this other group of carnivores that they're closely related to. And I just want to check, okay. So a little basic information about Fischers. What do they eat? They are a carnivore. They are what we would call a facultative generalist, which is just fancy words to mean that across their range, what they eat changes based on what's available. So they're not too picky. They can eat a lot of different things, and they kind of pick the best of what's available. In Minnesota, that tends to be snowshoe hares. They'll also eat red squirrels, and where gray squirrels are present, they'll eat gray squirrels. They are one of the very few predators that are a natural predator of porcupines. And so this is kind of an interesting part of their relationship. In Wisconsin, when they reintroduced Fischers, which I'll talk about in a little bit, one of the reasons they did that was because they saw a lot of damage from porcupines on trees. And so they wanted Fischers back in that ecosystem to be able to kill some porcupines and keep tree damage down. They also eat deer. There are actually videos of adult male Fischers killing fawns, but that's really rare. Usually when they eat deer that they find either dead on the road, like this picture, or they might clean up a kill from something else like a wolf. But they eat a lot of different things. They will eat some fruit as well, berries. And in Maine, there's a study that showed juvenile Fischers were eating a lot of apples in the fall. So they eat a lot of different things. The other thing I'd like to emphasize in the background here is just a little bit about their reproduction. This picture here is from California. Here's 2 Fischer kits sitting in a tree cavity. So they're younger, called kits. Kits are born in March in Minnesota. So early to mid-March is when female Fischers give birth. It varies a little bit across their range. On average, they have 2.5 per litter. Obviously, they're not giving birth to a half of a kit, but the range is 1 to 4. And usually a female in Minnesota can take care of 2 or maybe 3. There are instances where they might give birth to 3 or 4, but they can only really care for a few of them. And so they might lose a kit along the way. I guess I do want to emphasize too that for an animal their size, females are 6 to 8 pounds on average. males are 8 to 12, I'm sorry, 10 to 12, they can get bigger. But for an animal of their size, that's a really low litter size. And that has some implications for their population that I'll talk about in a little bit. One of the interesting things about Fischers is that after they give birth, within about a week to 10 days of giving birth, they mate. And so males find them at the reproductive den and they mate. So they're effectively pregnant year round. But what happens is they have this strategy called delayed implantation that a lot of carnivores use. And so what happens is the embryo develops to a small ball of cells. The development then stops, and it won't start again until about 40 days before they give birth, when the embryo will implant, a placenta will form and all that. And so the reason that they do that is that it allows them various checkpoints throughout the year to say, no, I don't have enough energy. It would be costly to me to carry this pregnancy forward. But it's kind of a unique system, and they're at the extreme end of it, where they really only have a week a year where they're not pregnant. And then the other thing I just want to emphasize is that males don't do much. This is typical of carnivores, especially carnivores that live alone like Fischers, where males don't do much, the females raise the kits alone. So the next thing I'd like to do is just go through a few frequently asked questions that I get a lot from members of the public when they learn that I'm studying Fischers. And the first question is, why are they called Fischers? Do they eat fish? And the answer to this is, we don't really know why they're called Fischers. There's not a good record of this, but we think that it comes from French words fichet or fichu, which is a name that's given to polecats. So they're a European species. You can see a picture on the slide. They're very similar to our domestic ferrets. And so the Dutch root vise, which is what fichet is based on, means nasty. So what we think is that French settlers thought they were polecats. They weren't, but the name kind of stuck and changed over time. We don't actually know. In terms of do they eat fish, they don't spend a lot of time fishing, but they certainly will in some situations eat fish, especially out in the Pacific Northwest, where you have big salmon runs and dead salmon might wash ashore. As long as there's not a lot of risk from grizzly bears, they will eat some fish there. But it's not a big part of their diet. The other question I get a lot is, are they mean? Or a lot of people actually don't even ask. They just say, I heard Fischers are really mean. And so are they mean? Well, the answer kind of depends on who you ask. I think if you could ask snowshoe hares, they'd probably agree that Fischers are mean. They are predators. They kill animals to feed themselves. There's a lot of concern from people I've talked to about whether Fischers would attack children or pets or even adult humans. And there's really just not any data to suggest that that's true. Where Fischers live in more suburban areas, they might occasionally kill or attack small pets, such as small cats or dogs. But even where studies have been done where they live in those situations, there's not a lot of, they don't consume those animals at a really high rate. So they really kind of want to be left alone. They're not, I don't think of them as being mean. So just to give a little bit of history of Fischers in our region, this map shows the historical distribution of Fischers at the time of European settlement in the Western Great Lakes area. And so you can see in the blue shading is where they used to live. And they used to be distributed really widely in this area. So most of Minnesota, they lived across the entire states of Wisconsin and Michigan. Iowa, I like to tease, I work with a guy who grew up in Iowa, so I like to tease him that Iowa doesn't deserve Fischers, but they used to have them. But even in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, we used to have Fischers across that area. Well, in the late 18 and early 1900s, we more or less lost Fischers from this area as a result of unregulated harvesting for fur, as well as large-scale logging. And so what happened was we removed their habitat. There were no regulations. People could kill as many as they wanted. And the dates here in red are the dates that Fischers were considered extirpated from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So extirpated, in case you haven't heard of that word, it's not extinction because Fischers still lived elsewhere, but they're totally removed from these areas. So I do want to note, I don't have any blue shading, but they were not extirpated from Ontario or Manitoba, so they existed there. But in the late 1920s, early 1930s, they were considered gone from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and probably earlier in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. I don't have those dates up here. And the reason I have a question mark on Minnesota is that they were considered gone and protected in 1929, but they probably still were present in the state in areas like the Boundary Waters or the Red Lake peatlands or other large tracts of wilderness where the effects of forest harvest and trapping didn't really reach. So fast forward, they started recovering in Minnesota more or less after they were protected. But what we saw in the 1950s is a increase in sightings of Fischers and in incidental trappings of Fischers. And that continued until 1977 when we reopened a harvest for Fischers in Minnesota. In Wisconsin and Michigan, there were reintroductions where they trapped Fischers from elsewhere and let them go. As I mentioned previously, Wisconsin, a lot of the reason for that was that they were worried that there were too many porcupines. But in the 50s through the 60s, they were reintroduced into the UP and into Wisconsin. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, they actually took some Fischers from the western UP and moved them east because they weren't moving fast enough on their own. So the gray shading here shows the current range of Fischers in this area. So they recovered a lot of their natural range, but there's still areas that they're missing. More recently, we've seen some range expansion in Minnesota, especially to the southeastern corner of our state. And I'll talk a little bit more about that right at the end. But we've also seen them move out to the west and northwest. And so that's a good sign that the Fischer population is moving to new areas. But we also have some concerns I'll talk about in a little bit. But in conjunction with those, the range expansion, we see a lot of really cool sightings right now in the southeastern area. So this is a picture from Hastings, Minnesota from this last April. And if you can see my cursor, there's a Fischer running through a parking lot in downtown Hastings. So I'll get to this again a little more at the end, but we're seeing Fischers do some things down there that don't really match what we think of Fischers doing. So moving in areas where we don't expect them. With this range expansion, Iowa has actually confirmed their first Fischer back in November 2011. That was the first Fischer documented in Iowa since the 1800s. There have been others more recently. These are probably moving into Iowa from Wisconsin and from Minnesota. And we don't really know that there's enough to be a population down there. But this is good news, especially in context with what I'm going to talk about in just a second. And that is our Fischer population decline in Minnesota. So this graph is a graph of the Fischer population size. The black line with the left y-axis is the fall Fischer population size. And the red line with the right axis is just a different index of Fischer abundance. And then years along the x-axis on the bottom. And so what you can see is that when we started trapping Fischers in 1977, we had an immediate decline in the population. But since about 1979, the Fischer population increased through the mid-90s. It remained at a really high level for about 5 to 8 years. And then starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we have this sharp drop-off. Very similar to what we've seen with moose, although we think there's very different reasons for this. But our Fischer population has dropped by 50% over the last 20 years. So it's not all doom and gloom. We do see some sign right now that the population is starting to tick up. We need to follow this out for a little longer. We've seen this sort of behavior before. So hopefully this is a real turnaround. But the other thing is that we do still have a population of 8 to 10,000. So it's not absolutely, we're not at a critical point. But Fischers have recently been listed as a threatened species by the Fish and Wildlife Service out in the South Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And so it's really important that we understand why the population changed in this way and figure out what we need to do to make sure that we don't get to the point that we need to consider listing them as a threatened species in the state. And so partly because of that decline and partly just to update the information that we have on Fischers for management, the Minnesota DNR led a research project from 2008 to 2015. They also, at the same time, worked on a project on martens, and that's where I came to Minnesota back in 2011 to work on the marten side of this. And so I'm not going to get into a lot of the results of that DNR project. They put a lot of radio collars out, about 115 Fischers. They tracked these from an airplane about every week, and they collected a ton of other data on diet and litter size and survival, habitat selection, home range size. And so there's a lot of really good information that we're still using from this study as we move forward. But part of this study was also aimed at trying to understand what's going on with the decline. And so there's really kind of three potential causes that we're interested in exploring further: potential overharvest from trappers, predation, and habitat loss. And so I'm really going to focus on these last two today. Feel free to ask me questions about trapping. There were some years during the decline that we had a pretty high harvest. It wasn't consistent, but it probably did contribute to the decline. But they've taken steps to make the harvest more conservative, and we haven't seen a huge increase in Fischers from that. So harvest is one of those things that it probably played a role. We don't think it's the main driver, but it's also very easy to regulate harvest in the state. And so that's something that we feel like we can really get a handle on if we need to. And so it's really the other two that we're looking at a lot more right now. So predation, what kills Fischers? Well, the main predator of Fischers in Minnesota is bobcats. One of the things we found with the DNR study was that almost all of the Fischers that were killed by predators were females. So male Fischers don't seem to be susceptible to predators. Out of the 21 females that were killed by predators, most of them were adults. And the reason that this is really important is that they tend to be killed by predators while they have kits in their reproductive den. And so not only does that cause a loss of the female, it also means that their litter is totally lost. So out of the 20 adult females that were killed by predators in the DNR study, 15 of them had kits in their reproductive den. By the time we figured out that the female was dead, so was her litter. And so as I mentioned earlier, females don't produce big litters for the size of mammal that they are. And so one of the things that's really important for the population is having high survival of adult females. And so the rates of bobcats killing female Fischers that we documented are not sustainable for the population. So one of the reasons that we think bobcats were killing Fischers in as high numbers as we observed was that during the same time that the Fischer population decreased by 50%, the bobcat population more than doubled in our state. And so more bobcats around, there's more potential for them to have this interaction with Fischers. And I do want to say, just really clearly, we don't favor one species of predator over the other. Both bobcats and Fischers are native predators to Minnesota, and we really want to be able to maintain healthy populations of both of them because of the important roles they play in our ecosystems and for recreational opportunities for people that want to harvest them. And so this is one of the major areas that my research is going to be looking at, is this bobcat-Fischer interaction question. And so we were supposed to start this project in July. We're waiting for the legislature to actually appropriate the money for the project. And this would be funded by the Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund. But the whole objective of this study that we'll be starting hopefully this fall is to determine why bobcats are killing Fischers. And so we're going to live trap Fischers and bobcats, put GPS collars on them, so we can see how they both use the landscape. And so the reason we think bobcats are killing Fischers is, a lot of people are surprised when I say this, they don't actually often eat the Fischers. What they do though is they kill Fischers so that the prey that they both eat are more available to them. And so we think prey competition is a big part of why they're killing them. We think that one of the reasons that they kill females during the reproductive season is because fishers come back to the same site every day, so they're easier for bobcats to find. But what we're going to look at is habitat use, activity patterns, and diet of fishers and bobcats to try to figure out what's going on. And the nice thing about this project is it'll give us good updated information on bobcats in the state. There has not been a radio collaring project on bobcats in the state since the late 70s, early 80s, and the population has increased quite a bit since then. So we want to update that information. And the other thing that we'll look at is the potential role of forest harvest on bobcat population dynamics. So stay tuned. Hopefully we get funding, and maybe in a year or two, I can come back and talk to you guys a little bit more about bobcats and fishers. So the other main concern that we have from the DNR project relates to fisher habitat. And so just generally, fishers are forest dependent. So non-forest is not habitat for them. They do have some ability to move across non-forest, but all of their time spent foraging and doing other things that fishers do is typically done in forests. However, not all forests are equal to fishers. So fishers generally need what we call structurally complex forests. And so what this means is that the forest has a range of different tree sizes and ages. It's not just a single condition forest. It has things like standing dead trees with cavities, as well as living trees with cavities, stumps, logs, or other woody debris, rocks. Boulder fields are really good places for some of fishers' prey to hang out, like rodents, root mass tip-ups. And so these complex structures provide a lot of different functions for fishers. They provide sites that they can raise their kits, reproductive dens. They provide sites for fishers to rest when they're not running around. They help protect them from predators, and they help protect them from cold weather in the winter and warm weather in the summer. And they also provide habitat for their prey. So obviously, as a predator, if they don't have prey, they can't really make a living because they need to be able to eat. And so I do want to just emphasize that there are a lot of different types of habitat, and we're concerned about habitat in a general sense. But for the rest of this talk, as I talk about habitat, I'm going to be focusing on reproductive dens, because this is one of the more limited habitat features that fishers need. And so reproductive dens, I mentioned them a little bit before. These are the sites where female fishers give birth to their kits and where they care for their kits until they're independent and they can go out on their own. And so again, this is the same picture from California of two kits in a cavity tree. The picture on the left is a female fisher from the DNR study going into this cavity tree. You can see the opening. She's got kits in there. So one of the things we know about fishers is that they pretty much need cavities and living in dead trees to serve as reproductive dens. In Minnesota, all but 4% of the reproductive dens that we found were in cavity trees. They also will use hollow logs, but they really only use hollow logs late in the year when the kits are more mobile, so that they don't fall out of a tree, so they can go in and out without having to climb a long ways. And so this isn't just true of Minnesota. Everywhere that fishers have been studied, we've had something like 1,400 reproductive dens that have been found, and over 99.5% of those were in tree cavities. So they really do need tree cavities. And so I do want to just step back. I care a lot about fishers and some of the other carnivores I mentioned earlier, but cavities are a really important habitat resource, not just for fishers, but for many, many other species of wildlife, some of which you can see pictured here. And so some of the concerns that I'm about to raise about cavity availability are not only specific to fishers, they're also potentially a problem for some of these other animals that rely on cavities. And so before I get to the concerns, one of the interesting things is what tree species fishers use for reproductive dens. In our studies, which took place largely in the Superior National Forest and in the Chippewa National Forest, they've mostly used aspen. So about 2/3 of the reproductive dens were in aspen. But they also use cavities in other species like oak, white pine, red and sugar maple, cedar, and then others like basswood, silver maple. There's another one I'm forgetting, so excuse me. But so are aspen really that important, or what's going on there? Well, we think that a lot of the reason that they mostly have used aspen where we study them is that it's a very abundant species and they form cavities pretty well. So some of the other trees like red pines tend to be really resistant to forming cavities. Aspen's not so much. But we do think that despite the fact that they use aspen a lot, it's just because it's on the landscape. And it's really the characteristics of the cavity that are more important. So anywhere that they have an opening that they can get into, but their predators can't, and they have a cavity chamber that's big enough to fit their kits, they could potentially use it. And so this is really important at the end when I talk about Fisher expansion in Minnesota. Aspen probably are not the primary species that they're using down in the southeast just because they're not very available.
Michael, we have a question about
Yes.
cavities and how high up in the tree they would have their den typically.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So fishers don't make their own cavities. They have to rely on other animals and other processes to make the cavities. So they'll use cavities at the height that they're available. And so what we see is some cavities are way up 30, 40 feet high. Some are just right on the ground. You could actually reach your hand in if you could fit it. So we think that overall they would prefer to have a cavity a little higher up because it gives them a better vantage point to look for predators before they leave. But depending on availability, they have to kind of make do with what's there. But yeah, we see, I think the average height is about 15 to 20 feet, if I remember correctly. Good question. Any other questions before I go on?
Yeah, I have a question. Suppose you see a hole in the tree. Is there any way if you would know if one had been there?
So
would they leave any evidence?
If you're very observant, you might be able to see a few hairs. So there's usually some sort of rough wood that will grab their hair. But the easiest way to tell if they're using a cavity, like especially early in the denning season in March, when we still have snow, is to see tracks. Or the other thing, if you have a trail camera, you could set up a trail camera and see if you see a fisher coming and going.
Okay, thanks.
We're actually, I'll mention something about temperature loggers later. We're actually trying to figure out if we can use those to monitor cavities without needing cameras, because temperature loggers are really cheap. If we can use that to determine whether animals are using cavities or not. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second.
Another question about dying birch along the shore. Do they use those for shelter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things I should emphasize this, and I didn't put a slide in, the way that cavities form, once a tree is dead, you will not get a cavity forming. So the type of fungus that creates heart rot has to be in a live tree. Once the tree is dead, that fungus dies. So if you have some rot, you might still get a woodpecker that could open up a cavity in a dead tree, but the fungus that decays the tree is no longer there. So once a tree dies, if it doesn't have heart rot and it doesn't have a cavity, it will not get one. So all of the fungus that penetrates dead trees and works on decaying them works from the outside in. So where there's dead birch on the North Shore that are big enough and already have a cavity, certainly fishers would use those. But if they don't already have one, if they're not big enough to have a cavity that a fisher can fit into, they may be used by other species, especially birds, but fishers aren't probably going to use them. Anything else before we move forward?
Kind of an offshoot of that other last question. Will restoring the native trees assist in providing proper habitat for them? Yes,
and it's not just a matter of restoring the trees, it's also a matter of letting them live long enough that cavities can form. And I'll get into a little bit of that in a few slides here. But yeah, regenerating forests, it takes a while after a cut for trees to get big enough and old enough that they can get a cavity big enough for fishers to use. But yeah, certainly. All right, I'll move on, but feel free to interrupt if you have any other questions. So one of the big questions that we have, and I should say concerns we have, is that cavities might be a limiting resource for fishers. And so one of the reasons we think cavities might be a limiting resource, and I should say, just to make it clear, a limiting resource is something that animals need that the amount of it will influence how the population is doing. So if they don't have enough prey, for example, a lot of species can be prey limited, where if there's not enough prey, the population is going to go down. And a good example of that is Canada lynx and snowshoe hares. So as the snowshoe hare population crashes, the Canada lynx population crashes too, because there's not enough prey available. So one of the reasons we're worried that cavities are a limiting resource is that female fishers absolutely need them to successfully give birth and raise their young. One of the other reasons is that the trees that they use are not very abundant in our forests. So on average, the tree diameter for reproductive dens is 20 inches. They can use trees as small as about 16 inches. And from some pretty intensive vegetation sampling, many less than 2% of the trees are 20 inches. 2% is if you consider 16-inch trees. Obviously, not all trees that big have a cavity that a fisher can use, so the actual availability of cavities is much less than that. And I do want to emphasize that cavities are naturally rare. You don't have a situation, even in a forest in the boundary waters that hasn't been cut, where every tree has a cavity. So they are something that's naturally rare. But because of that, we can have a really strong influence on the supply based on how we manage the forest. And so as I'll get into the numbers in a little bit, trees with cavities big enough for fishers to use take a long time to develop, but they can be lost relatively quickly, either from natural senescence, so the tree just getting too old, dying and falling over, from natural disturbance, especially things like windstorms that we've seen in the last 5 years. Fires in some areas can remove cavity trees, but also forest management. And so one of the things that we're really interested in is learning more about how our cavity supply may or may not have changed in the recent past. And in order to maintain a certain abundance of cavity trees, we need to balance out rates of formation of cavities with rates of loss. So if we're losing cavities faster than they're forming, we're going to be losing, cavity abundance is going to be going down. And so again, cavities can be lost by cutting the forest, by natural disturbances. And we can also influence rates of cavity formation by not letting trees get old enough. And so how long does it take for a tree to get big enough to have a cavity for fishers? Surprisingly, as I mentioned earlier, there's some 1,400 reproductive den trees that have been found throughout North America, but there's very little data on how old those trees were. There is some data from British Columbia. We're working on this in Minnesota as well. I do want to emphasize our data is preliminary, and hopefully in a few years we'll have finished this part of the study. But if you just focus on aspen, the average aspen tree that a fisher can use is somewhere about 90 to 95 years old. And if you know anything about aspen, not a lot of them live that long. And where we harvest them is a lot younger than that. And so that's where a lot of our concern comes into play about limiting resources, is that we need to have a natural resources economy in Minnesota. We are fully supportive of logging as an important economic part of our state. But we need to think about how we're doing it so that we can do a good job of balancing us taking the resources that we need and us leaving things for fisher and other wildlife. And so if it takes about 90 to 100 years for an aspen tree to get big enough to have a cavity, you would hope that they would persist for a similar amount of time, but we know that's not true. So we really don't have good data in Minnesota on how long a cavity will persist. It probably depends on the species and whether the cavity was in a living or dead tree. Here's an example of a marten den cavity from out in Oregon or California, where there's a nice snag here, and they came back in the spring and it was falling over and just completely disintegrated. So we really need to get an idea of how long they can persist so we can better understand whether we're likely to have a balanced situation where we're gaining and losing cavities at a similar rate, or whether we're likely to have a decreasing abundance of cavities. And so one of the questions is, well, if we're not gaining them fast enough, what can we do about it? And that's where the Minnesota Fisher Den Box project starts or comes in. And this is a project that we've been working on for about a year for a larger project, but we've been working on for a few years before that. And so the whole idea is, if we have to wait 80 to 100 years for a cavity to form, can we go and put artificial cavities, den boxes, into stands where cavities are not available, and thereby increase the habitat value to fishers? And so this study is really focused on two things. Number one, learning where fishers are willing to use den boxes and where they're not. And then number two, using that information to evaluate, is this a viable habitat management strategy that we should employ more widely across Minnesota? And so I do want to mention that the Minnesota Trappers Association for years now have been putting up marten den boxes throughout the state. And so this is a separate effort, although we've been in contact with them a little bit about their efforts as well. And so right now we have about 100 den boxes up. We will, in the next few months, have about 120 den boxes up. And so this is a cool project because originally we were only going to have two study areas. The one in the Superior National Forest that we call our White Lakes study area, this blue polygon, where we were going to put about 50 den boxes. And then this one that we call our Reamer study area that overlaps the Chippewa National Forest and then state and county land south of that, where we're going to put about 40 den boxes. Well, since we've started and given presentations, we've had a number of folks that have come to us and said, hey, we'd like to be a part of the study. Can we add on to your sample size? So Carlton County has 4 boxes right now. The Cloquet Forestry Center has 4. Hubachek Wilderness Research Center has 2 boxes. The Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe has put up 12 boxes in a different section of the Chippewa National Forest and the reservation. And then Blandin Paper Company has also approached us, and we have 12 boxes. We were just about to get them out, and then this pandemic hit. And so sometime in the next few months, we'll actually get those out. We still are working on where the location will be. But the cool thing is that this allows us to add on to the project a private company that's interested in how can we better conserve fisher habitat. And when I talked to Blandin, their biologist said, fisher's not doing well is not good business for forest products industries. We want fishers to do well. So that's a really cool collaboration. And what we've been able to do is increase our sample size and kind of the area where we have boxes. And so we don't just put up the boxes and then assume that they worked. We spend a lot of time and energy monitoring these boxes. And so we're using really 4 different methods to monitor the boxes to find out whether fishers or other wildlife are using them. Each box has its own remote camera that we go out and check every 6 to 8 weeks. We have a little hair snare, so a glue strip that goes above the box opening. That way, if a fisher goes in or out, the glue grabs a little bit of their fur, pulls it out by the root, and then we can either genetically or based on the fur itself. It just helps us know if the camera's missing things, which they do sometimes. During the season when they would have kits, we go out with essentially a GoPro on a stick, and we put it in there and get a picture so that if there are litters, we can see what the litter size is. But it also helps us look and see if there's anything else. So squirrels like to bring cones into the box. We had one, and I'm realizing now I forgot to put the picture, but we had a couple of intrepid flying squirrels that built a really big nest in one of our boxes. And then the last thing is we have a temperature logger in each of the box, which might seem weird, but we actually get really good information about when fishers are using it. So the cameras work great, but we do miss fishers going in and out of the boxes sometimes. And so this graph, it's a little complicated, but what we have is time and day on the x-axis here. The blue line is the ambient temperature, so what the temperature is outside of the box. The red line is what the temperature inside of the box is. And the yellow line is what we predict the temperature would be if there were no animal in it. And so what you can see is right when we pick up this picture of a fisher, we didn't see her going in the box, but we see her sticking her head out. Right when we have that picture, we have this increase in the temperature inside the box over what we would predict if nothing was in it. It stays in the box for most of the night, and then we see her leaving the next day from our camera. And right when she leaves, the temperature starts trending back towards what the temperature would be if she wouldn't have been in there. So this just gives us another way to monitor. Number one, is the box warm enough for a fisher to use when they give birth in the winter? And number two, if the cameras aren't perfect, it gives us a better idea of when they're going in and out. And the same is true with red squirrels and flying squirrels. We get the same sort of data where we see a spike in the temperature. And so this is where one of the things we're interested in is if we're monitoring natural cavities, can we go and put a temperature logger in there and use that to say, even if we don't know what animal it is, what proportion of all cavities are being used at some point throughout the winter? So I'm going to go through some preliminary results. It looks like there's a question maybe. Margie, is there a question on there? For some reason, I'm not seeing it.
I'm not either.
Okay, something flashed, and the last time it did that, there was a question. So no worries, we'll move forward. So I'm just going to go through some preliminary results, what we found so far. 80 of our den boxes have only been up for about 9 months, so we're still pretty early in this project. We have funding for another 1.5 years, and we're hoping to get more funding so we can do this for 5 to 10 years. But so far, from 89 boxes that we've collected pictures from, we have about 1 million pictures. And so this is a lot of time that it takes us to go through each picture, determine whether there's an animal in it, and then to characterize that. Is the animal visiting the box or is it using the box? And so right now we're trying to figure out some fancy software to use artificial intelligence so that we can let the computer go through, pull out all the pictures that don't have animals, like wind and other things that set them off. And then we can go through the smaller number. But it's a huge time input for us. We were anticipating when we started this project that we might get about 1 million pictures over 2 years, and we've been double that so far. But it's a good thing to keep undergrads busy. They really like doing this work too. So we've really only analyzed about 23% of the pictures. So what I'm going to show you is an incomplete summary of all the data we've collected. But I will say we have not, every box I think that has had a fisher, we know that it has because those glue strips have hair on it. And so we can know even before we look at the pictures that, yeah, a fisher was here. So first thing, we started back in March of 2018. We put a proposal in and we put out a couple boxes. We were hoping to get a picture of a fisher at a box to help us get the funding. It worked out. And so right away, we have this male fisher. This is a box in Carleton County, April 2018. Within a couple weeks of us putting out the box, he comes and checks it out. The boxes are sized so that male fishers can't get in. And the reason for that is that if a male comes to a den and there's kits and he knows that he didn't mate with that female, he will kill the kit so that she has a better chance of surviving next year if he's able to mate with her. So we do have fishers. So far, we've detected them at 16% of our boxes, which is pretty good for this early in the study. That same year, that same box, we did have a female fisher use it as well. So we're really excited. We put 4 boxes out that first year. One of them had a female and a male fisher use it and visit it pretty frequently. The following year, we had this cool interaction where it's during the breeding season. We have a female in the box, a male outside of the box. He's kindly asking the female if she's willing to mate with him. Her answer, if you can see her teeth bared there, is unequivocally, no thank you, I'm good. So we didn't see any kits at this time, but we were still really encouraged by this result because this is how female fishers use natural cavities to choose mates. And so seeing this in a box helps us understand that, yeah, they're viewing this artificial den box as a cavity that is there to use.
Nicole, we have another question, and I think it maybe refers to the photographs. One of our participants asked if this could be a project for a citizen science sort of effort.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've considered, my email address will be at the end, and if people want more information about that, they can definitely email me. One of the things that we've considered, we've had a few articles go out, one in the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, the Duluth News Tribune last fall did a story on our project. And I've had over 60 people email me saying, hey, I'd like to learn more about this. I want to put some boxes here or there. So one of the things that we've considered as a next phase of the project, once we really know where the best place to put them is, would be to go for a grant where we can use citizen scientists to help put out and monitor boxes that we build and deploy. So if you want more information about that, we don't have any definite plans right now, but this is something that we're very interested in once we do this initial evaluation. So if you might be interested, please send me an email and I can get you on the list for as we approach that. So here's another example of a fisher using a box. This box was up for about 9 months when these two, well, there's one in this picture, but there's actually 2 red squirrels that moved in. So you can see this one has a bunch of leaves in his mouth. They packed a bunch of cones in there. They packed a bunch of bedding material. Well, one night a male fisher came, found the box. You can see this red squirrel with the death wish is right there at the opening looking at who's knocking on the door. Well, as I mentioned, male fishers can't get in. So the squirrel hops back in the box. The male tries to get in, can't quite fit, tries to put his hands in there and see if he can reach the squirrel. Doesn't quite work. So again, we think that a lot of fishers find cavities as they're hunting. So this is just another cool observation that shows us that other wildlife and fishers are keying in on these structures and using them. One more example of a fisher. Here's a box from the Chippewa National Forest. This female found it about a month after we put it up. She spent a few hours in there, about 4 hours. She came out. She put a scat on the top of the box. As humans, we kind of think that's kind of gross. Why would you do that? But for carnivores, this means that she really likes it. She's marking it, trying to get others to stay away. She goes back in. She sleeps in there for about 16 hours before she leaves the next day. So at this point, we have not documented any litters in our boxes. One of the things we know from a similar study in British Columbia is that they didn't really start having litters until the 2nd or 3rd year of that study. So the boxes need a little more time in the woods for fishers to find them and for fishers to be comfortable with them. But so far, we've seen a lot of fisher activity and we're really happy about that. We've also seen a lot of activity by other animals. So martins like the boxes. We've had a number of martins sleep in our boxes and visit them. And we've had one, we don't know what it was because the picture was blurry, but it was carrying what was definitely some type of prey into the box. We've had flying squirrels. I forgot to put the picture on here, I apologize, but we had a couple of flying squirrels make a nest, but they really like to check out the boxes even when they don't go in. We've had a lot of other squirrels, not just flying squirrels. So in the Chippewa National Forest, we have gray squirrels in our boxes a lot. In the Superior and the Chippewa, we have a lot of red squirrels that visit them. In the Superior, we had a couple moose walk by. So clearly they're interested in what the box is. They're not going to use it. But still a really cool thing to see as we're going through the pictures. So here's a cow. Here's her calf, checking it out. I like to think they were admiring the handiwork, but probably they were more wondering what the heck's going on. They've been by a number of times at this box. And then bears and raccoons also seem to really like them. This bear, it's hard to tell from the picture, but he's actually about 3 feet off the ground. So one of the glue strips we used to use, it was a mouse glue board, and they were impregnated with peanut butter. So this bear was probably thinking that it was getting an easy meal. So far, they haven't torn any down. So overall, we have a lot of squirrel use. We've had a lot of mice. So Peromyscus is deer and white-footed mice. We've had a lot of mice and squirrels, and a lot of other things visit them. Porcupines are not visitors that we like because they tend to chew them apart. And so really, we're interested in fishers. These other uses are really important too, because these boxes do provide secondary benefits for other wildlife. Red squirrels, for whatever reason, really like to mate on the boxes. So we've had 4 or 5 now where we've seen red squirrels mating on the boxes. So we care about fishers, but other wildlife need cavities too. And so just a quick anecdote. This was a cavity tree in the Superior National Forest. A female fisher used it at the end of March in 2014. Back in February 2019, we went out to put a temperature logger in this cavity, and these 2 flying squirrels popped out. So we thought, oh, that's kind of cool. Other animals are using that cavity too. Well, we went back in June of 2019 to pick up our temperature logger, and there was a saw-whet owl nesting in that exact same cavity. And so I don't know what was special about this tree that all 3 of these animals liked it, but it is an interesting point that cavities are not just for fishers, they're for other animals too. So that's all I'm going to say about the Den Box project, and hopefully in the next few years we'll have better information about where fishers are willing to use them. So I know I'm getting close to 11 here, so I just want to have a few quick slides here to end talking about fisher range expansion in Minnesota. This is something that we're trying to get a project started with. We're trying to find funding for it. But we know that fishers have been more frequently sighted in the southeastern part of the state. This graph shows a number of sightings over time. So from 2005 till about 2016, there were no more than about 5 sightings a year for the whole area south of where fishers are harvested. But since 2016, we've had over 12 sightings a year. And I do want to emphasize that this year, we're about halfway through and we already have 15 sightings. So we don't know if this means that the population of fishers down there is expanding. Part of this is that more people know we want information on sightings, but it's interesting. And so this graph this map kind of shows you where these sightings have been. And again, we're mostly recording sightings south of where fishers can be harvested. But what you can see is that there's a handful of sightings along the Minnesota River corridor. Not a lot of good forest out in this area, but there is along the Minnesota River. There's a good cluster of sites in the Twin Cities area. So we see them a lot in areas where there's a lot of people, but there's also some fragmented forest. And then where most of our sightings are kind of along this Mississippi River corridor, where there's really good forest, but it is fragmented as well. And so with the sightings, we kind of have an idea of where they might be. What we want to do with the project that we're hoping to get funded in the next year or 2 is figure out how many fishers this area can support, and then do some work to be able to compare what are they eating down there, how long are they living, what are the sources of mortality. But it's really clear too, one of the interests that we have in studying fishers down here is that they're doing things slightly different. They're a little more tolerant than what we thought in terms of dealing with non-forest and fragmented forest. So here's a picture, one of these sightings of a fisher running through a field. There's forest around it, but this is not where we expect fishers to spend time in the open out here. And here's another one from Red Wing of a fisher. You can see the shade. There's a forest where this camera is probably set up, but it's pointing out on a cornfield, and there's just fisher out in the open. And so what we really want to know is how can they move through these areas, and will females and males both move through areas that are not typical fisher habitat, or is it just males? And then really kind of, like I already mentioned, figuring out how that population compares to the north. So I just want to quickly, I'm not going to name a bunch of people, but there's a lot of other people I work with on this research. I'd like to acknowledge them. Funding, part of the funding's from the Minnesota DNR and the Wildlife Restoration Act, but a large part of the projects we're working on now are funded by the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Fund as recommended by the LCCMR. And with that, I'd just like to say thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys. I'm open and I'm free for the foreseeable future. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to stick past 11 here as long as there's interest. So thank you very much.
Okay, it looks like we have a question. How do you tell a fisher from a martin in the wild?
So this is, I get a lot of pictures from people asking, is this a martin or is this a fisher? So if you have a good picture, the size can do it. Fishers have relatively longer and darker tails, and their ears are rounded. They look more like little bear ears. Their faces are not quite as pointy. Martins have bigger ears. They're generally kind of a chocolate brown in the summer, but more of a reddish color with a really pale face in the winter. So depending on the picture size, ears, some of it for me is just things that I can't articulate from looking at thousands and thousands of pictures of them. But I will say, if anyone has a picture ever of it from a trail camera or something that they want to send me an email, I'd be more than happy to respond and tell you what I think. You can't always tell for 100% for sure, but those are kind of the characteristics that I look at.
Well, I had a question about territories and how big a territory they occupy. And is there a difference between the males and the females?
Yeah, good question. And I should have included this information too. There is a big difference. Female fishers, their average territory size is about 16 square kilometers, which, if I remember my conversion, is about 6 or 7 square miles. So in that area, you're going to have one female fisher, maybe her kits, and then there might be 1 or 2 males that overlap. Male home range sizes are not quite double that, so they need quite a bit more space. But in general, any part of a territory will probably have no more than 2 or 3 resident fishers. If there's more than that, then they'll kind of duke it out and see who wins.
Wow.
But it's a lot of space, and that's one of the reasons that you don't see fishers a lot, is that they don't live at a very high density. If you were to encounter one in the woods, it would probably climb up a tree and watch you. And if you didn't see it climb up the tree, you might walk right by it without even knowing. Any other questions?
Margie, I'm not sure how the setup was. We got the time confused. Is there a way to get a recording of this and rewatch?
It's a little more technical than we've been able to figure out so far. Is that Renee?
Sedna.
Sedna, okay. I will check on that and get back to you.
Thank you.
So we missed the first part.
Okay.
I was curious. We see we have marten tracks in through our property regularly in the wintertime, and every now and then we have fisher tracks as well. They're quite a bit larger, so the difference is pretty striking typically. And I'm curious, what is the typical prey of the fisher here in northeastern Minnesota?
Yeah, good question. I do want to just mention too that if you have troubles with the recording, I would be more than happy to provide the slides. So if there's an issue with that, get in touch with Margie and she can email me or email me directly and I can provide the slides. So fishers eat pretty much whatever they can catch and shove in their mouth. In Minnesota, a lot of what they eat are snowshoe hares, red and gray squirrels. They will eat rodents too. In the winter, or where there's deer available from roadkill, or maybe deer that hunters shoot but don't find, deer that wolves kill, they'll scavenge on deer as well. In the summer, they will eat some insects and some berries as well. So they really do eat a lot of different things. Shrews and mice are a little too small for them to, if they only tried to hunt those, they'd have a hard time getting the food that they needed, but they certainly take them where they're available. And across their range, there's some new evidence of fishers potentially killing and eating rattlesnakes in the Northeast. They eat, in California, there's a lot of data on them eating birds and bird eggs and different types of lizards and snakes, frogs. So they do really eat pretty much what's available.
Very opportunistic.
Very opportunistic. Kind of like me after grocery day. They just kind of roam around and see what looks good and shoves it in their mouth.
So how high were those boxes placed typically?
So because of safety concerns, we weren't putting them more than the opening is about 10 to 12 feet high. And that's consistent with the study in British Columbia that had a good deal of use by Fischers. They actually had a box that was about 4 or 5 feet off the ground that had a litter in it. So, and this is a question that was brought up earlier too with their natural cavity dens. Some of them are really high up, 30, 40 feet. But because they don't make their own cavities, they have to kind of rely on what's there. And so we've seen them use cavities that are accessible off the ground, a couple feet, and all the way up. On average, it's about 15 to 20 feet though.
Now, where we live, which is right up from the Sugarloaf Cove, we have some large maple in our area, but we also have one of the largest sort of deciduous trees we have here is the yellow birch. Yep. And some of those are just massive. Do they also provide cavities for a fisher?
We don't find a lot of cavities for reproductive dens in birch, either white or yellow. But one of the things about yellow birch is that they're a good tree for porcupines, and fishers use them too, because what you get oftentimes when an old one falls over is you get the young ones growing over, and it serves as a nurse log. Yep. And so as they grow, that nurse log rots out, and then there's an opening, and that becomes what we call basal hollow, and porcupines love them. And some of those can be used by fishers, especially if a rodent or something else tunnels under when one of those is just forming. But yeah, it really is a lot of what they use are aspen based on where we've studied them. But big maples, big oaks, we've seen some basswood cavities, occasionally a red pine, but red pine don't form cavities very frequently. White pine. Cedars tend to be a little small. They're great for martins. Even a big cedar, the cavity tends not to be quite big enough for fishers, but we've seen a few of them that are. But really any tree that is 16 plus inches, has an opening about the size of a pileated woodpecker opening, and has a nice chamber, they would use.
So I grew up over on the Iron Range, and over there we saw porcupines fairly regularly. And if you didn't see them in the woods, you'd see roadkill, but they seem to be much rarer over here. It's rare to even see porcupine roadkill over in this country. Are they just not nearly as prevalent here? Do you know what the distribution is?
So I will tell you this, there is no good data on porcupines in Minnesota. And this is a huge shortcoming. Wow. We have a porcupine survey out right now. And this is another thing that might be a good opportunity for citizen scientists in the future. There's a lot of work right now out west to develop better survey techniques, but what you usually do is take a 6-inch square of plywood, you soak it in salt water, and then you nail it to a tree. And if you get them out the right time of year, porcupines have a high drive for the salt in the spring, and then they chew on it, and then you can identify from the chew marks whether it's a porcupine or not. So I don't know. I don't know why. We don't have an idea of how their distribution or density changes. We know that they're around. In the White Lakes area where our one Martin Fisher study area is, I see porcupines, but very rarely. In our study area in the Chippewa, we saw a dozen porcupines, live porcupines, walking along trails this past spring when we were out doing work. And so one of the things we really want to look at, because both bobcats and fishers can kill porcupines, we would love to try to get some funding to look more at porcupine density distribution, how they use the landscape, why they're in some places and not others, and then what that means for interactions between fishers and bobcats. But anything I would say on that topic would be pure speculation at the moment. But it's a good question. We don't really know.
We have another question that relates to porcupines and Fischers. Someone asks, there's been a significant increase in porcupines chewing cabins and wood structures. Is this due to a drop in Fisher populations or related?
Maybe, maybe not. So the one thing that's really evident is that out of all of the, and this is a project that we're working on right now, a literature review, there's a small handful of predators that can kill porcupines, but none of them do it to make their full living. So even Fischers that can kill porcupines without injuring themselves, you generally don't see it as more than about 20 or 30% of their diet. And so it could be that there's not a predator in the area like a porcupine. It could be that there's just other prey that are easier to get. And I will say the whole porcupine and damage on cabins and stuff, that's the same thing we're seeing with our den boxes too. That's an area where we're starting to read a little more on too, because it seems like there's some potentially good options for how you can avoid that haven't fully been evaluated. You know, there's things like you can put chicken wire and staple it on the first 2 or 3 feet, and that'll keep them from chewing. But there's other things like aversive agents that don't taste good that you can put on, and that's something that we actually may be trying to take a closer look at. Because I tell you, it's destructive when it happens to our boxes. I can only imagine having to deal with that with a cabin or a garage or something.
Yeah. A couple more questions here from folks. Are Fischers a major predator of ruffed grouse eggs?
I don't know. The problem with eggs is that we often cannot tell what bird species they're from, because the way that a lot of those studies are done is you take scats and you wash out all the pieces that didn't digest, and then you figure out what they are. So it's really obvious that it's an eggshell, but it's almost impossible to figure out what species it was from. So I don't know about eggs specifically. We have one picture from the southeast of a Fisher with a turkey. We do know that Fischers will occasionally eat grouse, although it doesn't seem to be a major component of their diet, not like bobcats or even some foxes. So yeah, it's a good question. If we get funding for that Bobcat Fisher project, we're going to look a lot more closely at seasonal diets of Fischers, so we may be able to get some more information there. Not necessarily grouse eggs, but just egg consumption in general.
Another question, what thoughts do you have about putting boxes in populated areas? There are parks in the Twin Cities, such as Westwood or the Wolfsfield SNA, about 20 minutes west of the cities. Would these be viable places for those boxes?
So I'm not to the point where I can make a strong answer to that, because we're still trying to figure out where they're willing to use them. I will say that if there's an area that Fischers are present and there's not a lot of cavities, Fischers and a lot of other carnivores that live in cities are pretty good at modifying their activity patterns to avoid humans if they want to do that. So the fact that there's people around wouldn't necessarily dissuade me from putting a box up. In fact, at College of St. Ben's and St. John's, they just put up 11 boxes recently. I have a collaborator in Dakota County that's talked about putting some up, but they haven't yet. So yeah, I guess with the data that we have right now, I can't say, yes, it's going to work. No, it's not. But if there's not a lot of cavity options and there's Fischers around, I have no reason to believe that they won't use it just because there's people around.
I have a couple other questions. One, are there plans available for the Fisher box?
If you send me an email, I can send you our plans. We're working on a nice document, but we haven't got that far on it yet. But I do have plans that I'd be more than willing to share. Great,
thanks. And is Joyce C at 0073?
There's no E. Yeah, JLY. The University of Minnesota played a major trick on me when they gave me my email address, because I have a lot of people that have tried to contact me and they're like, oh, he forgot to write the E in and they put it in there. So it's just JOYC, no E, 0073 at d.umn.edu.
Very good. And another question, I'm just curious. We've seen a few YouTube videos over the years of Fisher chasing snowshoe hares. And sometimes over a relatively long period of time, where they keep on the scent and on the scent and on the scent, but they're extraordinarily active and very persistent. Do Fischers hunt in a similar fashion?
You said you've seen videos of martins doing it?
Yes.
Yeah. Fischers and martins both do the same. So what a lot of the videos I've seen of martins, they remind me of the old cartoons with Pepe Le Pew, where the cat that has the stripe on her back is running as fast as she can, and he's just kind of bounding along. A lot of the videos I've seen with martins and Fischers, there's a chase, but they're not going full bore until they sense a vulnerability, and then they're right in there at it. So yes, Fischers use a similar strategy. What both of them do is they kind of zigzag back and forth when they're looking for rabbits in areas where there's a lot of rabbits. And they try to jump one. If they jump them, then they're going to pursue it. And yeah, I mean, I've seen some that's maybe 30, 40 minutes that it might take. But if you're a martin, that snowshoe hare is bigger than you. And in the winter especially, if you can kill that hare and pull it into a burrow where nothing else can get you, you have about a week's worth of food. And it's not quite as much for Fischers, but it is a couple days worth of food for a fisher. So worth the effort.
But I'm surprised they would need that quantity of food, Fisher, like a rabbit every couple of days.
Yeah, and so Fischers have a little more fat stores. So if they don't eat every day, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes they wait out really extreme cold weather. Martins, on the other hand, they only have enough body fat to last about 48 hours.
Wow.
And so they got to be out hunting pretty frequently. But if they get a big prey like that, they'll eat what they can, cache the rest.
Amazing. Beautiful animals.
Yeah, they are. And they're kind of like stomachs on legs because they do have these really high nutrient requirements.
Well, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, no problem. Really happy to give it.
Yeah, it looks like we've kind of reached the end of questions. If anybody else has a question, you can pop in here. But thanks ever so much, Michael. This is fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
I have one quick question, and I'm sorry we missed the beginning.
Fine.
So Fischers, martins, and weasels we've seen here up from Sugarloaf Cove. Are the weasels and martins as endangered? Which have higher population? Fisher, martin, weasel, which have lowest?
So there are more martins than there are Fischers in Minnesota. The martin population has declined, but not by the same amount. The Fisher population declined. It was essentially cut in half over the last 20 years. Martins lost about a quarter to a third of their population during the same time. But because they have smaller home ranges, you can fit more in an area. And there's no good population data on smaller weasels. But other than the least weasel, which weasels are just difficult because their populations move a lot spatially with changes in prey. So we don't have good information. We do have short tail, long tail, and least weasels in the state. Long tail weasels do live up in the north, but they're more likely in the south. Least weasels, we don't detect them for years, and all of a sudden they'll show up in a few places, but they're very rare. So in terms of population size, we certainly have more long tail and short tail weasels than we do martins or Fischers, just because their home range is so much smaller and they need so many fewer resources to support themselves.
Well, thanks everybody for turning up this morning. Had a nice turnout. And I will double check on some of those other questions that are pending and get back to folks individually on that. But yeah, I'm happy to hang for a second or two. yet. If anybody has anything specific, they want to do a more private conversation. But thanks everybody for turning up, and have a great rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I can, Margie, I can definitely share this PowerPoint with you too. I'll just convert it to PDF. And
Great.
then if anyone inquires about it, they can have that. If there's more questions, I'm always happy to take, I can't remember, I was going back to the Weasel page and then I stopped. Sorry if this makes anyone sick. Just getting to the end here. I don't have my phone number on here, which is fine, but I have my email. But if anyone wants to know more, they can email me. And if they want to talk on the phone, I can more than happy to provide my email or my phone number as well. As my wife can attest to, I can talk about weasels all day.
We all have our passions. I'm the same way with birds and geology.
Yeah.
So about weasels, where does the yellow stain on the hind quarters come from?
It comes from their anal glands.
It does. So that's
Yep.
part of the scent glands.
Yep. Yeah, because early in the year, right after they turn white, you don't see it. And it kind of, builds up over the season.
Yep. And again, as a kid, when I was a young boy, I used to trap weasel a lot. And that was, again, over in the Iron Range. And I don't, and there, any little creek you'd walk by that crossed under the road, you typically would see weasel tracks on and off. They seem to run the creeks pretty regularly. And over here, again, we've had weasels in our yard on and off, but I don't see the weasel track density that I did as a kid growing up over here either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for why. It's one of those things, I have a lot of ideas for finishing up some Martin Fisher work, but longer term, I would like to do more work on weasels and even some radio telemetry work. So other than interest in knowing what causes variation in density, I guess I don't have an answer more than I have an interest in that. So.
All righty. Well, I think we'll let people go ahead and get on with their Saturdays. You've got a little bit left back over there in Chippewa Falls, Michael. So
Yep.
I'll let you get on to enjoying your vacation. Thanks so much. And and thanks to everybody also for coming out this morning.
Yep, and I'm just going to take a screenshot of the comments since I haven't been able to read through them as we've gone.
Yeah.
There we go. Perfect. I see there's actually quite a few. I'm gonna have to take a few.
Yeah, I tried to bring those up as they came.
Yep.
So
yeah, I guess I was really wanting to just make sure I got the ones about who's seen a Fisher and who hasn't.
Right. That was not a vast response to that one, but
yeah, there's a few.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
All right. So long.